So, Eddy, welcome. I have to say that Eddy's been quite helpful, or very helpful, in the whole process over the last 3 years of putting the exhibition together, because knowing Francis in those times, and your friend Reinhard, also having talked about the work with Francis, the anecdotes about those times were very engaging and very, very useful. So, I've made a few little questions here, which I'll try and follow. So, first of all, though, Eddy, I think it would be really interesting to hear a little bit about your life between Sydney and Paris and what you do.
That's a very dangerous question, because once I start talking about myself, there may be no time for Francis Bacon anymore. Well, to make it short, I was born in Lebanon, and I did my schooling in French school. So my native language is French, and all my life I've been tuned on French culture. Wrote in French newspapers, taught French here, wrote French books, and always got interested in French culture. In 1960, for my 21st birthday, my father gave me as a present a trip around the world. And Sydney was, of course, in the middle of it. And as my sister was married here with an Australian, I spent a whole month, and I absolutely loved it. So I kept that memory, that vivid memory of Sydney in 1960. Then I went back and I had my university studies in Paris at the Sorbonne. And in 1962, I met Reinhard, who had just escaped from East Germany just before the Berlin Wall was built. And together, we have decided that Australia would be the place to be. And in 1964, we arrived here. I spent 10 years lecturing in the Department of French at the University of Sydney, whereas Reinhard was managing commercial art galleries, from Darlinghurst Galleries to David Jones to Holdsworth Galleries, etc. In 1973, I decided that I had to go back to Europe and do some research. I was fascinated by a poet, a surrealist poet, who was also a novelist, René Crevel, who was completely forgotten in those days. He committed suicide at the age of 35, and he was the most fascinating character. So I went back to Paris. I spent a year working on Crevel and meeting lots of artists who knew him, like Salvador Dali, because Crevel was the first one to write about Dali. He discovered him, actually. People like Max Ernst, André Masson, all the surrealists who knew him then. It was a fascinating year, because I got to know all these artists. By the end of that time, when I had finished my work, I decided that finally Europe was the place where my roots were, and that I needed to stay longer. So with Reinhard, we decided that we would sell our assets in Australia and go back to Europe and live there. And Europe meant, of course, Paris, because of my upbringing and my interest. And in 1974, we established again in Paris, in the Marais area, where Francis Bacon had just bought himself a studio. We were actually very, very close to him. And this is where we met. One day, by accident, I was visiting an artist friend of mine who lived in the same building as Francis, Vladimir Veliskovich. Veliskovich was in his 40s then, and he told me, you know, who has just moved into our building? Francis Bacon. I said, oh, really? That was quite a shock, because I had seen the work of Bacon in 1971 in the retrospective of the Grand Palais, and I had been absolutely stunned by his work. And I thought, oh, I must meet the man sooner or later. We live in the same area. And one day I was visiting Veliskovich, and who do I see in the courtyard, coming out of the studio? Francis Bacon. So I stood up, and then I went to him, and he was coming towards me with a big smile. And I said to him how much I admired his work, and I said that I came from Australia. And I knew that he was quite fond of the work of Brett Whiteley when he was in London. And I said, you know, I've just brought back a few late drawings by Brett. If you want to see them, you're most welcome. Oh, yes, yes, I would like to. So he came to the apartment. He climbed 5 floors without lift, and quite quickly, in spite of his asthma. I really admired his, I wasn't conscious of what he was doing there, but he was racing up. He looked at the drawings and he said they're very nice. Reinhard wasn't there, so I explained to him that I was living with somebody, and he said, oh yes, wonderful. And I told him the story which really he loved because he kept referring to it. I said to him, you know, when we were in Rome, Reinhard and I, we were in the court of the Vatican, and the Pope John the 23rd was blessing the crowd, and we were there. Reinhard is Protestant, I'm Greek Orthodox, but we felt that the blessing of the head of the Catholic Church was a wonderful omen for our relationship. And it was, because our relationship lasted for over 50 years now. So, to come back to Francis, I introduced him to Reinhard, and they got on straight away very well, because, see, Reinhard's attitude to art and mine are completely different. They are rather complementary. Reinhard is very intuitional, he's very instinctive. He looks at the painting and he sees straight away what is good, what is bad in it. He's got a wonderful eye. I haven't got that instinct. I like to analyze, go back to the painting, to the circumstances in which it was painted, to the symbolism, to whatever the artist wanted to put in them as a message. To me, a painting must carry a message. Otherwise, it's pure decoration. But Francis was much more of Reinhard's opinion, and together they got on very, very well, because when we used to go together to museums, I would try to explain my point of view, and Francis would dismiss it. He would just listen to Reinhard and say, yes, Reinhard, you're right, that's marvelous, that is bad, that is weak. They got on very well together. Now, he never discussed his work. He refused to discuss his work, absolutely. But we had a few circumstances where we were quite involved in the making of the painting. As we got on very well together, we were neighbors, we used to go out together to restaurants, to galleries, to museums, travel abroad together for 17 years, 17 last years of his life. We have visited a lot of museums and seen lots of paintings together. And we could see actually what Francis was looking for in the paintings of other artists. Traveling, we went abroad. We went to Stuttgart, where he had a show, to Frankfurt. In Frankfurt, there is one painting of Francis which is hanging, which is the figure from the Potemkin, which is very well known, which is reproduced in all the books. When Francis saw it, he went very silent, and Reinhard said, what's the matter? And he said, I wish I had never let this painting go. He was very, very severe for his own work. He was very severe for the works of others too, but especially for his own. And he destroyed quite a bit of his own work because he wasn't satisfied with it.
So that was the figure after Muybridge for the paralytic child.
The one from the Potemkin, the nurse with the mouth open.
Oh, okay, okay.
Which is in Stuttgart.
Yeah, okay. Which I desperately wanted to have, but anyway.
Well, he didn't want it to appear. And he said, oh my God, I can't say anything about the other artists in this gallery because look at mine. I wish it wouldn't be there. Among the special circumstances where we more or less interfered in his work, there are a couple of anecdotes which I could tell you if you wish. At one stage, he was painting, he said to us, I want to paint a wave. Let's drive to Monte Carlo. Okay, hired the car. I was driving, and Reinhard was making conversation with Francis. We arrived in Monte Carlo. He looked at the sea, said, oh yes, I know exactly what I'm going to do. When we got back to Paris, he started painting, but the wave became a jet of water. Because this is the thing with Francis. He starts something with an idea which is very precise. And in the course of the making, the whole thing changes. And he just follows his instinct. He follows his, what he says, his subconscious, which is leading him towards one form, one image, rather than another one. He called us when the painting was supposedly finished, and he said, look, I'd like to have a look at it. And we looked at it. He said, there is something that bothers me in this painting, but I don't know what. So we looked at the painting, and actually there was something which didn't click. The phone rang. Francis goes to the phone in the corner, and we were in front of the painting. He could see us, but we thought he was completely taken by his phone conversation, so we didn't try to hide anything. And Reinhard and I were looking at that spot which we felt was weak, and I pointed out with my index. I said, I think that's where something has to be done. Francis put the phone down, races towards us and says, I've seen you, Eddy. You're quite right. This is exactly where there is something missing, and I'm going to do it straight away. He puts gloves on, a palette of paint, and with all his strength, he hurls the paint on the canvas. We were petrified. We thought, what have we done? I mean, because of us, he's probably going to destroy that painting, he's going to spoil it completely. And he wasn't looking at the canvas when he did that. He was looking at me like, you see what I've done? Then he looked at the painting and he said, that's fine, that's exactly what I wanted. And he started to malaxing that palette, and the painting was finished, and it was perfect. It didn't need anything anymore. So that was really a luck, because he could have spoiled it completely. When he threw it, he said, I don't know where it landed. It landed in the right place, thank God. Now, that is one example. Another example is when he did a big triptych, a large triptych, which was with characters wearing hats. The two panels on the side were characters wearing those funny hats of the 30s. It wasn't really a very exciting painting. It was a little bit gloomy. But the middle panel was a wall covered with blood. And that panel really wasn't good. Francis asked Reinhard, what do you think? The painting was already there at the Marlborough Gallery in London. So Reinhard said, look, I think that as a triptych, it doesn't work. It's too much of an anecdote with these people plotting on the side and that blood in the middle. He says, but maybe if you separate them, each panel will be okay in its own right. And Francis said, yes, you're absolutely right. That's it. And he separated them. So the left panel went to Bailo. The right panel went to a Japanese collection. And he destroyed the middle panel. And of course, the Marlborough galleries were absolutely out of their mind. There was a triptych, and they were left with two panels. And they wrote a very nasty letter to Reinhard saying, will you please be careful what you say to Francis? So Reinhard answered them back and said, will you please look after your artists and defend their prices in auctions instead of giving me lessons? Because they didn't in those days. So our relations with the Marlborough were very, very tense from that moment on. There was a third example, which you have in the exhibition here. It's a very beautiful painting of a dwarf sitting on a stool. And that is a very odd shape. It's narrow and high, very unusual in the work of Francis. And the origin of this panel is one painting Francis had done in Paris, 1975, the year we met him. And he wasn't happy with it. Again, he asked Reinhard, he said, look, I'm not happy with this. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I'm really not happy with that left part doesn't work with the right part. And Reinhard looked at the painting and said, the right panel with the dwarf is absolutely wonderful. You can't destroy that. That would be really a pity. And Francis said, I think what I will do, I will cut that part. and I will destroy the left part. Okay. The painting went to England, and it came back 2 years later in Paris in an exhibition of Francis at the Galerie Claude Bernard, which was the huge success. The police had to actually close the streets which led to the gallery because of the crowd of the students of the Beaux-Arts and the people. Francis was practically carried in triumph, and he loved it. He loved the crowds crushing around him. So that painting finally survived, and it's very beautiful in its own right. And we were convinced that the left part had been destroyed. But after Francis died, there was an exhibition in Germany, and here appears the left panel, which was supposedly destroyed. Now, if you have the catalogue, you will see a reproduction of the whole thing with the left panel next to the dwarf. I still think it is a much better painting by itself, but that was another thing of the influence we had. I don't know if it is a very good influence in a way, because he took our advice, and we could have been mistaken. I would have never dared to make suggestions like that, but with Reinhard he got on so well, they understood each other so well that it was rather fruitful.
Well, we've done 1, 2, 3, and 4. That was great, Ed. It's making this very easy for me. But you know, you talked to him a lot. You obviously saw a lot of him. But you decided to make a book, and asked him if he would allow you to make some images for the book. Could you tell us how that went,
right,
and what his role was in that?
This was the very beginning of our relationship. When I met him first and showed him the Brett Whiteley drawings, I said to him that I was working on the publication of a book on René Crevel. He didn't know who René Crevel was, so I explained to him, and I gave him the manuscript. I said, look, if you want to have a look. He could read very well French. He was wonderful in French. And when he was a little bit tipsy, his French was absolutely fluent, much better than when he was sober. Anyway, he said, yes, I'm very interested. I told him Crevel was one of the great surrealists, which André Breton put above all the others. But he was gay, and Breton hated homosexuality. He couldn't bear the idea. He had a fight with somebody called Ilya Ehrenburg, because Ehrenburg said, surrealists, all pederasts. So he slapped his face in the street. That was 1935. And he could not be admitted to talk in the great congress of the revolutionary writers and artists. So he hated that absolutely. But Crevel was so dear to his heart that he dismissed the whole thing. Anyway, Crevel wrote novels, he wrote poetry, he wrote critics, books on art, and he was absolutely fabulous. At the age of 35, he had syphilis, he had cancer, he had tuberculosis, and he was getting desperate about reconciling the surrealists and the communists, because in those days they had to be together in order to have some kind of action. They had fought because of that slap of Ehrenburg, and surrealists were out. And one night he got so fed up with the whole lot, he gassed himself. He was 35. So in 1975, when I was working on Crevel, he was completely forgotten. His books were absolutely not to be found. But he was a fascinating character. So I think I conveyed my fascination to Francis, and he said, oh, yes, it's interesting. I said, you see, what I'm doing, I'm getting artists whom I have met while I was doing my research, artists who knew Crevel, and other artists who are friends of mine, in order to participate in the illustration of a limited edition. It'll be only about 145 copies, but all the etchings will be signed by the artists. I had gathered 13 artists, among whom there was Henry Moore, Max Ernst, André Masson, really great artists, Sonia Delaunay, who was a very dear friend of Crevel. I said, Francis, would you participate? And he said, look, I have never done any engravings. I'm not interested in taking a copper plate or a stone, make a lithograph or an etching. It's not my thing. I like oil and canvas. However, if it can help you, by all means, I shall allow you to use one of my paintings You have the print done by the workshop, and I shall have a look and say whether I agree or not. That suited me fine. And I got the Atelier Georges Visa, who was one of the best engraving etchings in Paris with Mourlot and Cromlenc. And all three were working on the book, especially Visa. Visa made a very, very, very beautiful etching in 3 different states. And we submitted them to Bacon. And he looked at the first one, he looked at the second one, he looked at the third one, he said, that one. It was his choice, and he had nothing to change to it. It was the portrait of Peter Beard, one panel of a triptych. So we did that etching, and we put it in the frontispiece, and that was the beginning of a work relationship with Francis. I mean, thanks to him, the book came out, because although I had all the other artists, the publisher was still reluctant. We wanted to have Dali, because Dali was so well friend with Crevel, it was natural. But Dali was extremely demanding. First of all, he wanted to have $100,000 for the signature, which was a lot more than the others. Then he said, I want to have the cover. There was going to be no cover. There was going to be a frontispiece, but no cover. So I said to him, look, you'll get the frontispiece if you want, but you see, there are other artists. There's Max Ernst, whom he knew very well, of course. There's André Masson. None of them is asking for a cover. There's no cover. I want the cover. And he went down from $100,000 to 50,000 francs. But he wanted to have his cover. And the publisher said to me, forget about him, because he was going to give us a mixed media, which would not be an original etching in any case. And the mixed medias of Dali, they were everywhere. But it's a bit of a pity, because Dali belongs to Crevel. Anyway, the book came out, and Francis was very happy with it. And I was delighted, of course. And a couple of years later, I did another book with Francis, this time with a text which related to his work. Actually, it was 4 different texts which dealt with contemporary art. The first one was about figuration, and that was Francis, who did 2 etchings. The second one was sculpture, and it was Henry Moore with 2 etchings. The third one was abstract art, and I had Hartung. And the fourth one was surrealism, and I got Mata. So there were 8 etchings. All 6 others were original etchings engraved by the artists. The only ones which were not made by the artist, but which were very, very strongly supervised by Bacon, were his. Now, for example, one of these 2, one is the portrait of Michel Léris. We've got the original in the exhibition. The other one is a naked man crouching over a basin. And for that one, we had a very interesting proposal from the workshop. The engraver said, why don't we make it in relief? So there was a Venetian blind in the back, and the Venetian blind was all in relief. The muscles of the man were all in relief. We managed to do that with a separate plate, which was all sculpted on top of the one which gave the background. So that was very successful, and Francis was very thrilled with that. He said, oh yes, I want to have that. Whereas he refused something in the background which was much more impressionist, and he didn't like that. So all the proposals we did, he had to choose and give his opinion on. This is where they are original etchings. Unfortunately, this was the beginning. Francis had never done anything before. And when these appeared on the market, everybody wanted to have something done. And they asked him to do this, to help that. And for example, Pierre Boulez, the musician, needed some money for some kind of foundation. And very generously, Francis never refused anything. So he would allow the workshops to make their lithographs or photogravure, and then he would sign them. But he didn't participate in any of those. The only 3 where he had to give his opinion were the 3 which were done with my book. And that I'm very proud.
Now, Eddy, I had the 5-minute signal, and we could either talk about the letter you wrote for Francis to Michel Léris, Or if there's something else you'd like to finish
No,
with.
I think the letter is important.
Yeah.
Now, one day he arrived in Paris, very excited, and saying, I have just had lunch with Michel Leiris. Michel Leiris is a very famous French writer, a great admirer of Francis, and Francis liked him very much. They used to go and have lunch together. And Michel says, you know, Francis, you are a realist. Big news. So I said, but Francis, you know, a realist is a label which usually is applied to people like Courbet or the 19th century realists. It's not very flattering. No, he said, I am a realist. I think what he wanted was to react against the label of expressionist, which was being put on his work in the 60s. I am a realist. I said, okay, you're a realist. He said, I've written down a letter in English to Michel to explain to him exactly what I mean with realism. Will you translate it for me in French? I said, okay, fine. So I translated the letter, and I kept the original in English, which is reproduced in the catalog. He sent it to Michel. He was all delighted. Now, I have discussed not so much realism, but the concept of reality with Francis. And we were never agreeing, really, because Francis is a very straightforward person for whom everything starts with birth and finishes with death. There's nothing, there's no afterlife, there is no God, there is no eternal soul, everything finishes with death. Okay. And the fulfillment for him is to live this earthly life fully. And God, he loved life. He would very often say, isn't it wonderful to be alive? Until the last year where he was so sick, and he said one day, he said, one can live too long. That was very sad, but by that time he really had been over several operations. And so the concept of reality for me, and also for him, but in a different way, was that there is no such thing as an objective reality for all, because objective reality would include everything. There are only subjective realities. There is only the reality that we create in being conscious of it. If you are conscious of something, it becomes real to you. And what he was trying to do in his painting was to let his subconscious lead his arm in order to create an image which is not a reproduction of the appearance, because that appearance is only a fraction of a subjective reality, but to create another subjective reality which you will impose on others. An image of a world which is parallel to the one we all agree on, and which suddenly reveals something which is real and which we are not yet conscious of. So he agreed on that as far as our consciousness of it comes from the subconscious, because he says the human brain is only used about 10% of its capacity. The 90% which are there should be activated, and like Nietzsche said, if you do, then you will be able to give back to man all the power that he has been able to put on the name of God. In other words, man is God, but he doesn't know it. So I didn't agree quite to that extent for that definition, but I agreed with him on the idea of the several levels of reality. And this is where his realism comes into expressing a level of reality which is not the one which is commonly accepted as an appearance.
No, and I think the idea of art, whatever form it takes, actually providing an opportunity for us to get that kick of reality in some way directly onto our own nervous system, this is language, exactly. I think is really powerful, and he sure as hell did it. Eddy, we ran out of time. Thank you so much. We could do another half hour, I think, without me saying a word. Thank you.